Lori Hansen. I work at Middlesex Community College, and I'm on the conference planning committee. And I just wanted to remind you to fill out your surveys. Even if you're not going to stay for the closing session, there'll be a box downstairs and you can just drop them off there. We really do look at your comments, and it informs future conferences to make them the best conference ever, which I think this year we've really done. I've been really enjoying the day. And so today, for another fabulous session, is Getting Down to Basics, Incorporating the Framework into a Sustainable and Collaborative Embedded Librarian Project. And we're welcoming individuals from Northern Vermont University. It's always great when we can see an example of a collaboration between Christy Castleberry, who's an assistant professor of English, and a librarian, Sam Boss, who's an assistant professor as well and director of the NVU libraries. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Sam, Christy.
It is, but that's good.
Many of you, all of you, I'm assuming, with one exception, have probably never heard of Northern Vermont University, and that's normal. It's a new university. It used to be 2 state colleges, and it merged to become Northern Vermont University.
Unified.
Unified, that's right.
We're not supposed to use the word merged.
We have to use the euphemisms. So if anybody's going through a merger, or will be soon, talk to us about that too. We're here today to talk to you about our experience with embedded librarianship in Christy's section of a course called INT 2040. This is a sophomore a critical thinking seminar that's required. Specifically, we want to talk to you about how we incorporated the framework into a rigorous yet sustainable and collaborative embedded librarian project. What we're going to do is talk about how we did it, what we did, how we developed the activities that are spread out through the semester, what our goals are, what's changed, and so on. So as far as learning objectives are concerned, by the end of our talk, we hope that you will have learned from us about leveraging the strengths of a collaborator and a project. So in our case, Christy comes to the table with extensive subject area knowledge. She's a medievalist. If you know her for more than 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you'll know how interested she is in the subject matter, and that's a good thing. She brings that to the table. What also is critical that she brings to the table is her ability to create community in a classroom. So when I walk into the classroom, or when we go in together, there's already a very tight sense of community, even if it's in week 1 or 2.
I would also say that he does try to come the first day, even though the library component might not start until later, so that he is a part of the classroom.
And that helps later on down the line in ways that I'll mention. And for myself, I bring to the table ideas of information literacy and how to integrate those concepts into the academic portions of the class. Secondly, we want to talk to you about developing activities that can be reused and deployed elsewhere. While embedded librarianship is fairly regular at both campuses of Northern Vermont University, the scale that we're doing it at here is fairly unique because it's very intensive, and we both devote a lot of our time to this, where this is not something we could do regularly. But what we take away from this are activities and programs that can be deployed elsewhere. So for example, I dissect what we do in Christy's class, and I bring those activities into everything from an art history class to a mountain recreation management class. So while we're doing this, we're also thinking about how we can redeploy these activities in other areas. We like to think that it's a very malleable sort of program. Christy?
Yeah, and I would say I've been able to use some of the activities now that we've done them together. I've been able to use them independently in other classes as well. And I think what we really have found is that simultaneously you want it to be as connected to the course and the course content as possible, so students don't see it as a separate throwaway day, but at the same time to make the activity something that can be pretty easily reformatted or reformulated so that it makes it more sustainable for us because you can't reinvent the wheel constantly, especially at a school like ours with not that many librarians, right? It's all Sam. So I guess what I would go from there to foster a sense of passion and encourage persistence is that I think it's for us, we get excited and we can persist because of the collaboration that we have, but it also makes it more meaningful to the students so that they can actually connect to what we're doing and not see it as a sort of one-off, but rather something they can dive deeply into.
As I mentioned earlier, Chrissy does an excellent job of creating community in the classroom. Students are often driving the topics that are being discussed. Well, you know, there's infrastructure there, but within that, students are the drivers. And we have found ways to sort of sneak information literacy into that student-driven curriculum that allows us to work with them when they're excited about the content. So for us, that helps foster that sense of passion among the students.
Okay, so, yeah.
Sorry, could you talk a little bit about, and maybe you already have this later, but how did you connect? Because that's what I'm kind of curious about. How did you make that initial?
Between the two of us.
Yes.
Should we?
And if you have it ahead, I don't just.
No, we
it's
did
fine.
actually. That's a good point.
I
Yeah.
think we'll hit that in when we talk about 1920, 40.
Okay.
We'll come to
If
that.
we don't come to it, call us on it. We will try to come to it. But I also think because we are a small institution and Sam is sort of the person for embedded librarian, so I think you did a professional development workshop on embedded librarians, which I came to, and we got excited talking after the workshop and kind of got going from that. That's kind of where.
That's pretty much how it started.
Yeah.
It was just through getting the word out through those channels.
And I think a lot of people that came to the workshop left wanting to do it, at least on some level. So that's where I kind of, it's connected for me. All right, so because I'm a literature person, I'm going to start us with a scene from literature because I can't help myself. So imagine that instead of a beautiful day in June, it's a dark and stormy night. Classic, right? And Victor Frankenstein is in his lab and he's trying to bring a creature to life, which is what we have here, although that's very skeletal. I'm not sure it's quite ready. I think what my point is that if you look at this image, at this point, Victor's totally comfortable with the idea of his creature and creating life because it's not alive yet. It's just a thing. It's an object to him. And to him, life is something that he imbues. It's a one-way ticket. So he has the spark of life and he can give it to you. And as soon as the creature wakes up and opens his eyes and has his own perspective in mind, Victor is out of there. I think we can say that Victor makes a few mistakes. That's not the only one, but that's the big one, right? As soon as the creature has its own subjectivity, its own perspective, he is freaked out because he sees it as something he can convey, not something that is a sort of mutual two-way street. So I think that for many of us who have background in education, we understand that education isn't a sort of I stand up here and convey the knowledge to you and now you have it, that it's got to be interactive. Students have got to engage with it. Even if students are watching a lecture or reading a book, we want them to be thinking, questioning, responding, engaging. So that had always been something super important to me, but what I didn't realize is that I was still treating information literacy that way. I was still thinking of information literacy as something that, well, I can just show you how to do a citation and now you know, voila, information literacy. I wasn't realizing that I was teaching information literacy the way that Victor was treating life, that I was seeing it as something I had and I could give them. And so, because of this, can you move forward? When I started teaching INT 2040, that's critical thinking, reading, and writing, and it's a themed class. We can teach it with whatever theme we want, and my theme is monsters, hence Frankenstein. So I always do Frankenstein in that class. When I started teaching it, I thought, well, they've already had library workshops and instruction in their 2 writing courses. We have 2 semesters of writing courses. So by the time they get to my class, they'll know how to do a citation, they'll know how to find the library. I don't need to do that. I can just do it on a case-by-case basis. You can imagine how well that went. Hint, it didn't go very well, right? So it was a disaster. There were, tears and rending of garments and whatnot. And then by the time I got to the second semester, I went and sort of begged someone at the library to help me. And I started doing, and this is sort of getting to your question of how we ended up connecting. So it wasn't actually Sam at that point, but I started doing the one-shot model. And then that worked, that helped. So I started doing the I guess I would call it a two-shot model, right? Where we had sort of a scavenger hunt and a sort of library day. And this helped just insofar as the students seemed less freaked out. They seemed more comfortable, a little bit less anxious, especially when we got to the annotated bibliography. The scavenger hunt included them having to actually ask questions and introduce themselves to people in the library, so they started to realize that they could ask for help. Because when I was in college, didn't realize that I could, so I wanted to make sure they knew that there were people on campus who could help them. And that did help, but I just felt like they weren't getting practice, right? It was being sort of conveyed to them, but again, in that sort of one direction that, I've got a computer up here, I'm showing you all the stuff, and now go forth and do it. And I really wanted something more consistent where they could actually practice the skills. So that's where Sam came in. I went to his workshop on embedded librarians, and we started thinking, okay, if we have more of these, they can actually practice. It spreads out the material so it's not so much all at once. And that helped so much, but what I realized is that I was still thinking of it in terms of separate sort of information that we were dropping on them. So what happened was that we've played around with the number of sessions. I think our height, it was 7. We've got it 6 now, which is really good. But even some of the days where Sam doesn't come, I do things that were inspired by what we do together. But it's not just the number of sessions. It's that the sessions that we do are totally integrated into the rest of the semester. So it doesn't feel like, here's critical thinking and here's a library day. It feels like it's all critical thinking, because what I started to realize, especially as Sam introduced me to the framework and we started talking, is that I want it to be part of the critical thinking they're doing. I don't want them to just sort of take it at face value, and I've shown you where to find whether this is peer reviewed, so at the end, you know if it's peer reviewed or not. I want them to actually think about what makes something credible or authoritative. I want them to becoming part of an academic discourse. Some of you all know this already. I see nods. I'm amongst friends here. So I think as a literature professor, I had been thinking of the literature as something we were thinking critically about, and Sam helped me see that it's all part of it. So I think that's the big thing is that we just integrated it more. So that the students could see it as part of the class and not, oh, here's a day I can sort of zone out because it's a separate day.
Because it's library day.
Right, it's library day. I've already done that. You're right.
So the big thing for me there was going from 7 independent library days to a seamlessly integrated series of workshops. And now we're going to start talking about the different activities we do and when they do them. And I know that I referenced the framework in the title, so we'll talk about how we've integrated the framework into these activity weeks as well. As I go through and talk about each activity, I'll talk about the knowledge, practices, and dispositions that we focus on, and I'll talk about how they're integrated, and I will talk about what's changed and what we're doing as of today. So by the end of weeks 1 and 2, we want students to have practice collecting and citing work that will help them in a debate setting. So we think of this as, or I think of weeks 1 and 2 as debate prep. But what we're doing really is trying to help students understand the idea of scholarship as conversation. I made the mistake early on of going to the class the first week and actually talking about scholarship as conversation. Like, I used language from the framework and I said, scholarship is conversation. You had never seen people's eyes glaze over so fast. So we sort of jettisoned that talk and found ways to integrate it into an activity. The first knowledge practices. We want students to cite the contributing work of others in their own information production. So one aspect of that is practical. We have them actually do an MLA citation, just so they understand the mechanics.
Or they can do.
Or a Chicago MLA or APA, just so they understand the mechanics of it. It's not a huge thing. They get a point if they do it. We don't get mad at them if they put the period somewhere else. It's just to sort of jump into the pond a little bit. The bigger piece of this is understanding that they're becoming members of a community of practice. They're entering into a conversation that's been taking place for however long. So if they're talking about environmentalism or genetically modified organisms, what have you, they know that they're not just practicing in a vacuum. They're becoming members of a community.
And this is, we have just watched Jurassic Park at this point, so that's where these topics are coming out of.
Right. So
The original Jurassic
they're going to do a debate on Jurassic Park. So the bigger piece with the first knowledge practice is actually to get them to use the work of others to back up an argument and be ethical about how they use that information. We want them to critically evaluate contributions made by others in participatory information environments. So that really is coming to the table with a strong argument, a well-researched, backed argument. So when they get to that debate table, they're prepared. And of course, this translates into defending an argument in a variety of different scenarios. And recognize they're often entering into an ongoing scholarly conversation and not a finished conversation. So the debate is just step one. Everything after which follows is really, it all starts here. The research process, the information they collect, how they defend their points is going to be relevant for the remainder of this class. So as I mentioned, we want them to know by the end of weeks 1 and 2 that they are becoming members of this scholarly community. They are researchers and they are communicating with people who've done research, whether those people are still alive or not. Again, this is big on debate prep. At first, as I mentioned before, I went into the class and talked to them about scholarship as conversation, and I mentioned how that didn't work very well. So we got rid of that pretty early on. Another thing that we did throughout this evolution of this weeks 1 and 2 scholarship as conversation unit was we moved the activity I'm going to describe in a few moments to before the debate. So we actually do a research activity with them that prepares them to enter into the debate scenario. Another thing we did was we allowed the students to start picking topics. So at first, I think we gave them 6 or 7 topics, put them in groups and said, now find information and win the debate. Obviously, students weren't really passionate about it. We picked the topics and then it was sort of boring for them. So we turned it into a student-driven event. They picked the topics and it's proven to be beneficial. A bigger thing for me, from the librarian's perspective on this, is that this activity, what we do in the activity I'm about to show you, allows me to really revisit the lessons or the information that I try to impart in what I call Library Workshop 1. So here you see, revisit Library Workshop 1. Christy mentioned this earlier. Every student at Northern Vermont University goes through what's called Library Workshop 1 and Library Workshop 2. It's connected to what you think of as English 101 and 102. In Library Workshop 1, we use what I call our foundational resources. So I see on your tag you're from Credo?
Yep.
Okay, so Credo reference is part of what I think of as a foundational resource. Students leave 1081, English 1081, understanding how to use Credo, when to use Credo, and why to use Credo. Foundational information. Think of that as building that, that base of knowledge. So students are expected to use opposing viewpoints and context and CQ Researcher, in addition to a variety of open web-based sources to gather information on the topics that they've selected. These are actually examples.
Possible ones.
Yes, and these were topics that we pulled from students. They use opposing viewpoints and context in CQ Researcher specifically so that they can argue for or against something related to one of those topics. And additionally, we want them to identify and vet a mix of open web sources against the library sources that we introduce them to. And this really is big for me because it reinforces what they learned in Library Workshop 1 a year previous. Also, they evaluate open web and proprietary foundational information sources, so they're really getting that practice from 1081, again, which is critical for me, because I don't like leaving students after that first year and hoping that I'll see them again. And lastly, they're getting practice documenting sources. So they're expected to document the name of report platform, name of website, and who's responsible for it, both on paper and as they're speaking, of course, in the debate setting. So I found this to be an excellent way to review what we cover in Library Workshop 1, English 1081, and to bring this into Christy's class. But I often have questions for Christy about how this works from her perspective. So, since we did move the activity to before the debate instead of after the debate, have you noticed any differences in how students handle the debate scenario?
Yeah, it's been huge. So initially we moved it before the debate, but we still didn't tie it thematically to the debate. So we would do it before the debate saying, this is practice thinking about multiple sides, but we would give them topics that had nothing to do with what the debate was on. But now that we've got topics based on what they're interested in for that film, I noticed them actually citing, I always encourage them to cite each other during the debate and cite me, and we model it too. So I'm like, remember when Sam earlier said, or, but now I notice in the debate they'll have notes with them and cite things that they found in that activity. So I feel like it's been huge because before they could see, I don't think they could understand how it was related to what they were actually doing in class before. I think it seemed like a separate thing. And so now that we actually have themes related to what they want to talk about in the debate, they bring that information with them and actually incorporate it. So I think it's been really good. The only thing I've been thinking in terms of what to do in the future that kind of maybe goes against what I just said is that part of my point when I do the debate is that there are never just two sides. And so part of what I do while they're debating is I sort of take notes and start to see how these little sub-topics come up. So for example, with Jurassic Park, you might get two people that end up arguing with each other over how the dinosaurs are treated. For example, that's why we put zoos up there. So one person, the argument, for example, is on whether the character of Hammond is a monster. And if you haven't seen the movie, Hammond makes a dinosaur park, things go poorly. Pretty much sums it up, right? So the question is whether he's a monster. But there might be two people who say, one of them says, well, he is a monster because he has this lysine contingency that could wipe the dinosaurs out and he doesn't use it. That's irresponsible. He should be protecting the people in the park, right? And then somebody on the other side will say, no, it would be monstrous for him to use that because he brought these creatures back. He has a responsibility to them. All of a sudden, that's its own debate, right? That could be its own debate. So what I do while they're taking the debate is I sort of make notes of these smaller issues that are coming up or these different issues that are coming up. And so it would be cool to either do something after it where they dive into those or maybe a follow-up where I could even follow up and have them go back deeper. But because I think ultimately I am wary of thinking that anything's at two sides. There's never just two sides to the story. So part of my purpose with the debate is that I want the debate to fall apart. I want it to actually splinter and fall apart and not work so that I can show them, look, there's way more than two sides in this room. So I feel like there's something I could do, maybe even just the way that I follow the debate up, that could connect more to that. But I certainly see them actually citing the stuff that they found during the debate. And before we do that activity, I actually have them go back through the movie and gather evidence from the film for debate. So they've got that already, and then they're adding in this other sort of more theoretical context.
And let me grab something out here. I didn't bring enough to share, but I can certainly hold them up so you can see.
Yeah, we should have.
So
if anyone's interested, we can always email you stuff.
Certainly. Week 9, we jump a bunch of weeks there, and then I come back. And this is actually the only sort of workshop type of one-shot, I guess. This is probably closest to a one-shot as we get in this class. This is week 9, and we're focusing on research as inquiry and searching as strategic exploration. By the time week 9 is over, the activity is concluded. We want students to have used various research methods based on need, circumstance, and type of inquiry. So we want them to know, to be able to use a variety of sources to find what they're looking for. So we encourage them to use open web sources. We encourage them to use proprietary resources. And we encourage them to talk with us, with their classmates, not just rely on what's on the screen. We want them to use differing search strategies and understand first attempts do not always produce desired results. So a lot of times, students in this course, because they are second-year students, will refer right to JSTOR or ProQuest Central or Academic Search Premier, and they get frustrated after their first attempt of not finding the perfect article that probably doesn't exist. So we want them to know that this is a recursive process. And of course, we want them to seek multiple perspectives, and again, understand it's a recursive process. For me, for my part, the week 9 activity allows me to revisit what we do in English 1082 in the spring semester. So we take things a step further in Library Workshop 2, which students get in their English, I'll call it 102 class. The ideas that we're looking for, we really start thinking about authority and credibility, and making sure students are really checking out those concepts in English 1082 and Library Workshop 2. And we asked them to do that in this library workshop. Initially, this was a topic building workshop, so we were prepping them to start a research paper. And we thought if we used the Credo mind map and the Gale topic finder to start thinking about their topics, the language associated with their topics, and the resources associated with that language, we could help them get a little bit further. But we found that that wasn't working quite well. It was too constrained. Students weren't able to really use the language that they use to find resources on topics that they were interested in. So we shifted topic building to weeks 10 and 11, which Christy will describe momentarily. We jettisoned the mind map and the topic finder. That gets used in earlier sessions. And we focused, our focus moved to search strategies and the critical evaluation of information. So I mentioned earlier that this is the closest thing to a one-shot. We actually do a little bit of guided research with them. We remind them how databases are used, which databases are available, which database should be used for a specific purpose, when you would want to use a book, so on and so forth. We started off with this 2-pager here. It looks pretty dense. Students are expected to complete this. They basically follow the example. What you can't see, but I'm looking at right now, is that this is really sort of asking students to be methodical about their approach, which really doesn't help these students. What we did was revise this. Now it's a little bit cleaner, a little more white space. What we're asking students to do is really to focus on authority and credibility rather than documenting a source. So our research is inquiry and strategic, searching and strategic exploration has really taken shape, and it focuses more on acquiring resources through various channels and making sure that you're looking at who's responsible for those resources, how they were created, and what they say about your subject. Now, one more question for Christy. As I kind of alluded to, this project, especially week 9, has gone through a lot of evolution. How was the development of this activity collaborative from your point of view?
I think the way that it was collaborative is it actually became less and less of a one-shot, because it's as they're starting to write papers on Frankenstein, so they're finding, so when they do this worksheet and when they find sources, they're supposed to find at least one article, at least one book, they're finding things that they're going to use in their paper. So they don't see it as like a waste, why did I have to do that? It was busy work. They see it as helping them do the research for their paper. So I think that was huge. So what I would say the biggest collaboration aspect is that Sam's bringing his knowledge of the databases and of how to find certain things, or how to fill out this, how to make the hanging indent. That's hard. So he's bringing all of this sort of information literacy knowledge, but I come at it having worked with them enough to know what their paper topics are. So I can help them develop their topics and arguments during it, and we kind of bounce off each other in that way. So they're writing Frankenstein papers, and they have, we've together used JSTOR. I have a list of articles that are all in JSTOR, so they have to go in there to find them, but it's pretty guided because I have a list. And we go through, they choose one and write a summary, they choose one and write an evaluation. So during that process, they've kind of narrowed their topics. I know what they're interested in by this point. And so a student who was super into Mary Shelley's life, I can get Sam to help them find a good biography, for example. We had a couple students last semester really interested in scientific aspects of the novel. One was super interested in scientific ethics and wanting to connect that. So we looked maybe in very different kinds of databases for scientific ethics article, so whereas another student was interested in what was the science of the 18th century, what was going on at that time. So we looked for different kinds of articles with them. A student really interested in gender was so excited to learn that Mary Shelley's mother wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women, so they wanted to find that. So I think what makes it collaborative is that I know what they're interested in the novel, and I know what their papers are starting to be well enough that we can make it meaningful to them, and they get really excited because they wanted to do this paper, and now they've got material. So they no longer see it as a busy work kind of activity where I just have to fill out this sheet. It's an activity where they're actually finding something that they're excited about, that they're going to be able to use. It's going to make their life easier because now they've got all their sources already.
One of the things that I appreciate about working with Christy on this project too is that she really helps students understand what the scholarly conversation is. I'll admit that I was probably like 30 some years old when that light went on, and I was like, that's what the scholarly conversation is. I was reading this book by John Demos about colonial history, and in that book, he was sort of arguing with 2 or 3 other historians that were writing at the time, and you could see that they had this conversation happening, and I almost started to laugh when I realized what was going on. With Christy's background in medieval literature and history, she's able to work with students, like for example, there was a group of students who were doing a project on werewolves, and Christy was able to help them understand who these authors were, what they're talking about, why they're referencing each other, and what it is they're doing. So all the while we're talking about how to search for resources, she's able to bring back that idea of scholarly conversation full circle and sort of re-inject that into the conversation.
And I think because this point in the semester as well, in our class discussions and in the debate, I encourage everybody, and I also model for us to actually cite each other. So when Sarah said such and such about Frankenstein, it made me think this, or right, that like I try and have them actually like cite or quote or paraphrase each other. So I think by the time we get to this activity, we can say, see that thing you've been doing out loud, now you're going to do it on paper. So. All right, so then this is where we get into the heavy portion because we're moving toward the research paper. So Frankenstein paper it's not a full research paper. We all read the same novel and they have to have at least 2 secondary sources. So it's just kind of baby steps. So then after that, we're diving into the research paper unit, and that's when Sam starts coming like every week, which is nice. So in week 10, we do research as inquiry and information creation as a process, and that really builds on what we're doing before. And this is maybe a little like a one-shot insofar as it's not directly tied to the papers that they're going to write, although for many of them it ends up being that way. But really just actually practicing how to narrow a topic. So what we do for this one is we give them topics that are super broad, I mean ridiculously broad, and then they pick groups based on, and we can kind of, we shift the topics around based on their interests as well. They can say, hey, why aren't there werewolves? And we'll make a werewolf group, for example. But we give them topics that are purposely way too broad, and they get in groups and try to narrow them. So they actually just dive in and try and narrow them themselves rather than us telling them how you might do it. So we've found that about 4 people, 3 or 4 people per group. I guess you could go up to 5, but I would not do more than that. It's good. And we give them topics like zombies or werewolves, or sometimes even like monstrous humans or oppression, genocide. They could be pretty big. And then as a group, they work on narrowing it. And the point here, and we allow them for this week, we allow them to use databases, library resources, but also the open web, anything they want. And the point is to see how the research process and the topic formation process are sort of mutually constitutive. So for example, one group who's interested in zombies might be like, well, I wonder how that started. And they might look into the origin of it and realize that it started in connection with slavery in the Caribbean. And so they kind of get really excited about that. And as they find more sources about that, it helps them narrow further. Another group also doing zombies is more interested in how it gets used in pop culture, and they might see, okay, there's a lot of sort of films with zombies where it's mindless consumerism, it's in a mall or something, right? So they might look into different kinds of sources. Another group doing zombies might be interested in, is there a sort of medical connection to this? And they might look at very different kinds of sources. So the point is that each group can narrow it however the heck they want. It doesn't even have to stick to our original topic. That's part of it too. We give them an original topic and it can turn into whatever they like. Just as a group, they work on narrowing it. So they can just practice how looking at sources can help you narrow and then help you find more sources because you narrowed, and et cetera, et cetera. And they start thinking this week a little bit about how it's, what makes something credible. We'll go into it more next week, but for example, the group doing sort of medical stuff with zombies, what makes somebody credible for that might be that they have a medical degree, they're a practicing physician, something like that. Whereas somebody who's doing the zombies and slavery, very different things make them credible. Maybe a history background that they write on that part of the world, folklore, something like that. So starting to realize that not only which places are better to find information for different topics, but what makes something credible for different topics as well. So we make sure that they have at least 5 minutes to report back, longer if possible, because they can share successes and failures and what sort of places were better or worse to look at, and share back just what they found, how it went.
The resources they found, the people who are in charge of those resources, so the authors or the people that have credibility. We like them to talk about, especially if they found a variety of sources. So for example, if somebody's doing something on vampires and pop culture, they're going to be referencing scientific literature, and they're going to be referencing blogs, on the open web. So we like them to talk about who's behind those resources, why they chose those resources, and how they work together well. How you might use one and how you might use the other in tandem to strengthen an argument, and do that so you're not damaging your own credibility.
When we first started doing this activity, I'm going to talk, we do it as a 2-week activity, so I'll talk about this part 2 in a second. When we first started doing it, we did it as just a one-off activity. And we actually we would get them in groups and give each group a source, and they had to examine the credibility. So one group we'd just give a website, another group a magazine, another group a scholarly journal, and they had to examine the credibility and then report back. But it really wasn't they weren't sort of excited about it, right? They were just doing it. So we turned it into a 2-week activity, and what I will tell you is that it's like a full week apart. So we have another class in between, and they're like, when's Sam coming again? When are we going to do part 2? Because they're coming up with the topics, they're getting really passionate about them. And the great thing is that when they do come up with their research paper topics, I guess I was meant to talk about this in a minute, it's so easy now. It used to be painful, and now in one class period, everybody's got a topic, whether or not it comes out of this or not. So sometimes they come up with a topic they actually want to use. Sometimes it's just a seed for a topic. So for example, one student this semester who was in the zombies as mindless consumerism group ended up getting interested in consumerism and ended up connecting it to climate change. So even though his final topic wasn't where he started, it still was the jumping off place. But even the students who don't do anything related to the topics, they know how to come up with the topic now because they've actually done it. The week 1, they're just trying to come up with what their topic is together. There's really no guidelines of what you can look at. Anything's fair game. Week 2, we get back into the same groups, and that's what they get really excited about, because when week 1 ends, they're like, but I haven't finished yet, I want to do more. So they get back into those groups, and this time we want them to actually zero in on a couple of sources. So at least one library source, at least one open web source, and looking at credibility. And this time to really sort of get into the nuts and bolts of what makes something credible for their different topics. And this is where we can talk about things like, just because something's a .com doesn't mean it's off the table. It's just what are the things that you should look for to make sure it's credible. Just because something's a .org doesn't mean that it's great. What's that organization? Who's behind it? So getting them, again, not us telling them what's credible, but them deciding as a group what they think constitutes credibility.
That's really sort of thinking back about English 1082 at Library Workshop 2, and then what we did in week 9. So we're consistently reinforcing those skills.
And we take at least 10 minutes a group to report back, because they tend to share a lot of things that end up really helping them. So for example, maybe 2 different groups came across a website from an organization, and maybe they had different methods of finding out what that organization's all about.
A lot of times,
Yeah.
the report back sessions turn out to be Christy and I acting like children. Well, they will say something and we go, why?
Why?
Why? So we ask them really to think critically about who these people are behind the sources and why they're using them.
But just because it's printed, just because it's a university press doesn't mean it's free of bias, and just because it's a website doesn't mean it's not, right? That it's, again, not just us telling them what's a credible source, but we want them to actually be thinking about it. So, does this work? Oh, yeah. So some of the questions, we like put a bunch of questions up. This isn't like a thing they have to fill out. They don't have to check off each one. And sometimes they come up with other questions that aren't on here. But we get them to think about things like, who is the author? What organization or institution are they affiliated with? If it's something that doesn't list an author, what can you find out about whoever put it together? If there is an author, what else have they published? So maybe they are super credible, but it's for something, this is out of left field for them. They haven't really done something like this. If it's from a newspaper, what's the newspaper associated with? If it's, let's see. What's something interesting you found on their social media? This one's actually really fun when they're reporting back. They get, yeah, and actually sometimes there just isn't social media, which is interesting too. And sometimes it's like silly, like they get excited because the person has a hedgehog that they pose with or something. But sometimes they found out, oh, this person posts super specific political things. That's good to know, right? So stuff like that they can kind of start engaging with and seeing this. And it also helps them realize that the person that wrote this is a person. There's somebody behind this, a human, right, behind this. Would you consider this person an expert in their field? Why? All kinds of ways that we might think about that. Why do you think this source would be useful for this topic? So even if something's credible, it might not be helpful for you for this topic. Anything else you noticed or discussed? Some other questions for journal articles: who's the publisher? Is it peer reviewed? Who's the audience? Stuff like that. For a website, who's the audience? What's the purpose of the site? Who's behind it? My warning example is always something that happened in a class a few years ago, which is that somebody was looking into the English-only education debate and found a website that they thought was pretty credible, but when we dug into it, we realized that it was actually a neo-Nazi. Like, there was nothing to say that. You had to look into it, right? It was meant to look credible, but you don't want to accidentally quote Nazis. Right, I think, and actually once you know that it was a neo-Nazi website, that makes it a super interesting primary source. Why are they interested in this? How are they putting the information together? As long as you know that's who put it out, you can use it, but you don't want to accidentally. So thinking about who's behind it is super important. So again, we don't make them fill out something, we make them take notes so they can report back. Just what are the kinds of questions we want them to have in mind? And again, as a group, they discuss and decide what they think makes something credible for them, what they think would be good or acceptable, how they would use it if they were doing that paper. So it ends up being really fun, actually, the way they report back, because they get kind of attached to these sources, they get really angry at these sources. I mean, they get pretty excited. So especially with the social media, that one gets, yeah, there's a lot of dog people. They find pictures of people's pets, they like that.
We had one student searching for cameras and events. Conspiracy theory thing.
Yeah. Okay, so my question for our librarian here is we developed this into a 2-part activity over time. So initially, like I said, we would just give them sources, and it was a much more contained. With your background in library instruction, what do you think is the value of this extended workshop? I mean, how do you see this? This is maybe different than what you had done before.
Right, so the title, the word sustainable is in the title of this presentation, and everything that we've discussed so far doesn't seem sustainable really in any way because it's so demanding of our time. This has become a 2-part activity over time. It used to be a 1-part activity, or a one-shot, I guess. Now, for me, I really like to extend this over time. A, I get more time with the students, and B, we get more time to work out the nuances of the activity so we can take this and deploy it elsewhere. Really, what this has done for me, my interaction with Christy, and why I continue to do it, is because it's sort of like a training ground for other areas. So I can package these things and take them into other venues. that's why I continue to do this, and it's actually, it's a lot of fun to work with Christy if you haven't.
We have a lot of fun, yeah.
Seen, yeah. So the value in it for me is that it's almost like training and practice. I can repackage these things and bring them elsewhere, and I don't have to spend 2 weeks in every class doing it. I mean, we can wrap this into, we can take these ideas and wrap them into a 40-minute workshop in a speech class or something.
Yeah, we can take pieces of it. Also, once you've done it before, it's not a heck of a lot of prep work to do again. It's more on the students to put in the yeah. So at that point, we're moving into the research paper unit. We do topic formation. As I said, it's a breeze now. It's just painless. Like they come to the topic. The class where we're coming up with their own topics, often they come with topics in mind. It's just so nice. Like I can't tell you how much easier it is now. How many fewer tears trying to come up with topics. So we go into the coming up with their own topics. They write a proposal draft, a research proposal draft. And what we started doing is a guided research day after the proposal draft has already come in, but before they revise the proposal or do the annotated bibliography. And this is the sweet spot we found, because we've tried the guided research day at various times. If we do it too soon, they're really just using it to figure out their topics, and it's just a repeat of the topic activity. But if we do it too late, they've already done so much research on their own that they're like, well, what the heck? Why did we? So we do it after they've already written a draft of their proposal. Their topic is somewhat set, but still a bit malleable, still kind of forming. Because the first draft of the proposal is always way too broad. They want to do something that's like a multi-volume series of books rather than an 8-page paper. So it kind of helps them narrow, but also find sources. And so I think many of you have probably done guided research days. It's something both of us have done in classes before. I've had a lot of classes that featured a guided research day, and it's always useful, but what's different here is that by the time we get to it, they've practiced skills so much all semester, and they're coming to it just at a different level of engagement. So I feel like it goes deeper, and the questions that they can ask us are more specific, more hearty, if that makes sense, so that the day ends up being a heck of a lot more useful. I think it's always useful, but in my experience, a lot of times it's just like, are there any databases that are psychology databases or something, right? It's a little bit more surface level, whereas here they're really diving in. So I find it, I would say, more useful than it always was useful, but more useful. And I also would say that there was another activity that we did have as they were working on their annotated bibliographies that was an annotation workshop, but we felt like that just ended up feeling redundant or like a little overkill, or poor Sam has other things to do in his life. So I do a version of it myself, and I think that's the nice thing about any of these. The way that we've both deployed these elsewhere means we can do versions of them. We don't always have to both be there in order to do them. So if they started to feel like it was a bit redundant when we had too many in a row. So we found this was our sweet spot. That might be different for everybody. And so in thinking about the guided research day being more useful, I wanted to kind of bring it back to Frankenstein where I started. So here's an illustration. If anyone's familiar with the novel, or some of the films or theatrical depictions, there's a part where Frankenstein's creature learns language, learns how families interact, learns basically everything from watching a family through a chink in the wall, which is creepy actually if you're the family, but he doesn't know any better. But it's kind of like if you sit your toddler in front of a TV and expect them to learn everything, right? He's learning from reality television. So this is the one-way model of education, right? Where they don't even know he's there, he's just watching them through a hole and absorbing. That's how families behave, that's how people speak. In fact, even though he's in Germany, he learns French because they're a French family. Right, so he's just absorbing and trying to understand and grapple with what they're doing, right? And it doesn't matter whether he's there or not to them. And so that is a model that we could do, right? Where we just demonstrate ourselves. We put up on the board, sort of like we're doing now, right? We could put up on the board like, here's how you find if it's peer reviewed, and here's how you put together. And that's the model that the creature uses, except, he turns into a monster, so it doesn't go out that well, right? That in order for it to really work, there needs to be that engagement. There needs to be that back and forth. He needs to be able to understand and think critically and think, well, is this how, like, there's a reason why he thinks that he's a monster when he looks at his reflection, because the only thing he sees is them. He can't see how he fits into it, right? So what we want our students to do is bring their own ideas, their own passions, their own excitements, so it becomes a dialogue, not just between us and them, between each other, between the groups, that we want them to actually see themselves as part of it, to see each thing as something that they're, I guess that they have a stake in, that they're part of this conversation now. They're becoming part of the community that has a right to discuss things, right? That is participating. So we want to move away from what didn't work out too great for Frankenstein's creature and into something that actually creates a living, breathing being that can function outside of our classroom in the future.
And for
moving
us,
forward.
we want to create living, breathing activities that can be redeployed elsewhere, repackaged elsewhere, that are malleable, but we still get these same results. So that's where the sustainability and all this comes in. Obviously, this is not something we could do 3 or 4 times in a semester. The idea is to take elements of it and bring them out to other classrooms, working with other professors in different contexts.
And I've seen, I have to say too, just anecdotally, I don't have, statistically significant data on this, but anecdotally, I've seen not just within the class that students have an easier time, their grades are higher, their papers are really a joy. It's not just within that class, but also I see students that I work with in later semesters actually still using this stuff, which is the hardest thing, right, to get. We hope that everything we're doing in a particular semester is going to change their lives, right, but they move on to the next semester and it's gone. So I do see them being able to use these skills outside of what the framework that we're, or not the ACRL framework, but the framework that we're using in class, the content.
I think maybe we have 9 minutes left.
Should we? I think we could have done
I
that
think we've covered
one.
most
We
of
can
it.
go to our where's the grit. So just really quickly, I think it's grit for us and for the students. So it's grit for us in that, we're all overworked, right? We're all overworked and we're stressed, and just the collaboration aspect and getting bouncing ideas off somebody outside yourself, bringing different skills to bear has been really helpful for us. The continuity, creating things that we can, it take a lot of thought and planning the first few times, but then you can sort of pretty easily roll out without having to do a lot of extra work. That's sustainability. Grit for the students because they're engaged, because they see how these things how they're actually going to use them, and how they connect to things that they're passionate about, they're excited about, topics they've chosen. So they don't see it as busy work or this is the day I can zone out, but I really have to pay attention because I'm going to use this in my paper. So I think that, did you want to build on?
No, I think that.
So I think our hope is that there's passion and persistence for us and the students in this model. And I think the really big key has been making, no matter how many workshops you decide to do, even if it's just one, making it so that it's actually integrated into what they're doing before and after rather than separate. I think that's really what has been the magical piece here. Any questions?
I have a question for you. When you are assessing the students' work, how much are you thinking about the dispositions and knowledge practices, whether it's explicitly written into a rubric or wording outcomes, or are they things that you're actually looking for?
Yeah, I think quite a bit.
Yeah.
And actually, we didn't mention this, but Sam does a little bit of the assessment too.
Oh.
So there are a couple, like the article book worksheet, he's the one that gives the feedback and grades, and citation as well. And there are a couple things where they have homework that he grades and he assesses, and then he talks about it when he comes to class. But in their papers, for example, when they're citing secondary sources, I look very specifically at how they're introducing their sources, how they're responding to them, how they're talking about them as someone they agree with or somebody who's credible. I try, and I think actually just working with Sam has been really helpful to me because he's given me the language by giving me the framework, which we were kind of thinking about things in similar ways, but we had different jargon, I guess, right? So he's given me a whole new way to frame it. But I think it really has affected how I assess everything from a summary of an article to a full-on research paper. Certainly, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, especially the thing about the language, because I think I love the framework, but I feel like it takes a long time to really get everything that's in there, and when we're trying to talk about it with faculty, it's like, how do you fit all that into like, oh, here's this great thing called the framework, but there's just so much there, so.
I personally found that not talking about the
Yeah.
framework when you're talking about
Yeah.
the framework has been most effective.
Yeah, just kind of like demonstrating.
Right.
Yeah.
I think this is maybe for Sam, but I'm just curious, I think this is a very interesting micro perspective, right, in terms of how you did this specific example, but I'm sort of thinking about the macro perspective, and from a library perspective, like, you've already said it, it's impossible, right, you couldn't do this campus-wide, but how are you looking to expand this? Are you looking to expand this, A, and B, if so, how would that take shape given the not only the intense collaborative nature of this project, but the time commitment that we're going to require of both sides, but particularly on the librarian side, with everything else the person has to do.
So if you take this completely out of the context of our school and our situation, that would be a really tough question to answer. But because I have experience working with the faculty members, and I understand the departments, I understand the composition of the university, it's a little bit easier. I wouldn't expect to replicate this in any other class. This is really unique to INT 2040. It's really unique to Christie. But I don't ever intend to replicate this specific project. But what I do is I take elements of it and I'll apply them to, like I mentioned earlier, in our history course, especially what we do in weeks 10 and 11. So I can take what takes 2 weeks in Christie's class and do it in 175-minute class period, a similar activity that gets students to work on authority, credibility, and searching for resources. Or I'll take it into a mountain recreation management capstone course where I'll spend a little bit more time with the students. But we handle these activities on a much more sort of methodical and practical basis. So regardless of well, it looks a little bit different each time. I don't know if.
So it's almost like this course is the full menu, and then depending on what the other courses need, you pick and choose elements from the appetizer course, the main course, the history course.
So what I normally don't say about this to other people is that I don't do things so I can do this. This is not a project that, as I mentioned, that I could do in other classes with other professors simultaneously. I do this so I can create that menu, so that menu exists, and so I'm continually, we'll try to stick with the kitchen metaphor, in the kitchen, fashioning the dishes, adding new ingredients, taking old ingredients out. So when I do bring it to art history, when I do bring it to Mountain Rec, I can deploy it quickly and easily without a lot of
Extra
time pressures.
I would also say that part of the point is that neither of us needs to be there for any of these to exist either, right? So I've got other classes where I've sort of repurposed some of these activities, and he's taken some of these activities to other faculty, and those faculty will then take them to other classes. We could do professional development workshops where a bunch of people are there, and they might all find different ways to use an activity. So it's not like we both have to be there for the entire semester every time or even at all. Like, our idea is that this kind of way of thinking and way of teaching information literacy is spreading, right? We're trying to...
So there's like a teach-the-teacher element.
Yeah,
as well.
right. So obviously we enjoy doing this together, but neither one of us has to be present for somebody to do any of these. So I think that's part of it too, is that making something that is can exist outside of us.
Or we both don't have to be in the same room at the same time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I also think that there are schools where it would be feasible to do this on a much grander scale. Schools with research librarians where there'd be specific people for each subject that could. I mean,
You've You've been to one of
I've been to one of those schools, right. So I think that it's something that you could expand or contract depending on the resources that you have and the number of people that you have wherever you are.
So this is sort of an example of enjoying your work.
And the students love it, yeah.
How would you, if you, just asking about the expansion to other classes, and then piggybacking on what you were just saying, if you had, I mean, because so what's palpable, you know, about how you're talking about this is that it sounds like the students get a lot of, I think that well, what comes to me is that the students are, because of the extended period of time that you have with them, I think that it's almost like you're giving them permission or allowing them to unlock the creativity that they're going to be able to do to engage with the actual topic. Whereas if you have a one-shot deal, it's kind of like, okay, here's the databases, here's a project, good luck, and then they don't even know what questions to ask yet. So it's kind of like the database teaching comes and goes, and then there's a million questions they probably have down the road that they don't have that connection with you or the librarian to ask. You know, it's kind of like almost like a disconnect. So the question is, sorry, it's going to be a long way to get to the question, is if you were to replicate this in a smaller fashion, how would you, in other words, taking to the 2-week thing into a 75-minute, how would you replicate that extended support that they are actually getting in a 16-week class?
So two things. I'm going to jump right in. I'll reference the Mountain Recreation Management course that I do. The capstone course, which is a 4,000 level course, research-based course that the students have. Yes, sorry. It's a 4,000 level capstone course that all Mountain Recreation Management students have to take in order to graduate. I flip it, basically. I take the first 3 activities that we do in this class, turn it into a video. The skills that they are supposed to have. So by the time I get to the class, they'll have, most of them, they are Mountain Rec students, have watched the video and do something like this, a research activity. So when I get to class, they have the questions ready to ask. We don't spend a lot of time with me lecturing, or we don't have the luxury of doing what we can do in Christy's class, but it's very practical. So flipping it is one way that you can save time, having them do a lot of that work on the back end. I'm not a web designer. I do have to do web design. I'm not a videographer, but I do have to work with certain software that allows me to capture, you know, screenshots and my voice and things like that. You can make it work if you have to, which we do on the cheap. So that's one way to handle it, is by flipping it. And of course, hybrid teaching and those different methodologies are sort of running rampant now, and it's pretty easy to get involved or to get some direction there. I was going to say something else, but
I think also scaffolding, right? So that Sam can make sure that they're getting different things at different levels. So by the time he gets to them in that class, they already have a familiarity with him and with some of the material.
and relationship building.
Yeah.
So each time I work with an instructor, it's pretty clear what my expectations are. And in fact, I think it's good for the librarians to go into it with expectations. You know, if you have somebody that wants you to do 7 one-shots, then you turn around and go the other direction, because it's a drain on your time. By the time, you know, we have the videos, they do the activity, I expect the instructor to reinforce and to make sure that the students are coming to see us if there's issues if issues come up with students.
And I would say, just as an instructor, that some of that, the instructor needs to take responsibility to make sure that they are connecting forwards and backwards, and that they are building on what you did, you know, when you came to the class. I think that's really important, that even if it is just a one-shot, that the instructor has the mindset of planning for a semester where this is a part of it rather than just a separate thing. So I would say, just as from the faculty perspective, I think that's on me to make sure that it's actually a part of the class, and that I'm relating to it. And again, kind of going back to your initial question, that I'm including things from it in how I assess, in what I talk about later, in the activities that we do, that I'm taking the responsibility to make sure that it's connected. So I think partly it's just from making sure that you've talked enough to do that, even if regardless of how many times you're coming, if that helps.
Do you have a question?
I can ask after. I think it's not really. So my school defines embedded librarianship differently, and because there's, I don't want to make it sound like only, but there's only 12 liaison librarians for a 30,000 student campus, right? We're embedded in the building for 3 hours a week or so. So that's our the embedded librarianship is we have office hours in the building with the departments. And so I was going to ask Sam, have you ever had experience with that type of librarianship being embedded rather than physically continuing more than one instruction session in class?
It's interesting that you mentioned that because I mentioned earlier that we just merged with another state school, right, our sister college. They have a more extensive online program. So there's an embedded librarianship program that corresponds very well to what you described, except it's virtual.
Right.
I often go back and forth with the person. That's not embedded librarianship. But it's all semantics, right?
Right.
The idea is that, we're reaching the students. So yeah, we do have a little bit of back and forth with that. And some of what we do on the Linden campus where Christy is based has gone over to the Johnson campus where I'm spending half my time now and vice versa. Does that?
Yeah.
And I think you could sort of institute that a little bit even at, even when you have fewer students, fewer librarians in that, for example, on my class page and on my syllabus as well, I have his email, his contact information, his office number as well as my own. I make sure that students know that, so this kind of goes back to your question as well. So if they think of something later that they want to ask, they know that he's somebody they can still talk to,
Right.
And they know when and where and how to find him.
Is your information on the CMS or LMS?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do is we'll integrate our services into Canvas. And we used to use Moodle, but now we're using Canvas. So we use tools like SpringShare, LibGuides, LibWizard, and push those into our into Canvas in order to help us have that virtual reference desk, I guess we call it.
Yeah.
So we embed ourselves into the department that way.
Cool. Thank you for that.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
When those librarians go in for 3 hours a week, is it at least the same person each time?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's the subject specialist. So the person that I'm thinking of is the sustainability and architecture librarian, and she is in the design building twice a week.
Okay.
And so she has an office with a desk and door open, and students can come by and just drop in and ask questions. And the hope is, as the business librarian, I will be in Eisenberg providing reference, in person in an office with a desk. Somewhere in the new innovation hub so that if students think of questions, they can come directly to me. And the hope is that professors and faculty will say, oh, your librarian is this person, her office is right down that hall, right? Or if you can't find her in the office, send her an email.
I really like the idea of getting the library out of the library, whether it's
Yes.
physical or virtual.
Well,
I think
especially,
that's-
my building is it's the biggest one on campus, and it's really scary to a lot of people. They're like, oh my God, 26 floors. Do you have to go to every floor to get a book? And so, going to them means that they don't have to leave their, and it's sometimes a blessing and a curse, because you want them to get out of their department and come to the library, but at the same time, it's sometimes easier for them to come to them.
I think we're a little over time, but we'd be happy to talk more with anyone, or if anyone wants to, we should have put our email addresses on here. We can give you email addresses, yeah. Are they in here? Because we'd be happy to answer questions later as well. But thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.